The bullet that shattered the saloon window sent Eleanor Hartwell diving beneath a table before she even registered the sound, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. Dust settled around her trembling form as boots thundered across the wooden floor above, and she pressed herself smaller, making her body as insignificant as possible, while the chaos of Tombstone, Arizona territory erupted around her on that scorching afternoon in July of 1881. She had only been in town for 3 days, having traveled from Boston with nothing but 2 carpet bags and enough money to survive perhaps a month if she was careful. The advertisement for a seamstress position had seemed like providence when she found it tucked into a discarded newspaper at the train station in Tucson, but now, cowering beneath furniture while men shouted and glass shattered, Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake leaving the only home she had ever known. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it began, replaced by the heavy silence that follows violence, broken only by the nervous shuffle of feet and the tinkling of glass shards falling from the window frame. Eleanor remained frozen, her fingers digging into the rough wooden floor, splinters pressing into her palms. She had learned long ago that staying still and quiet was the safest option when men became loud and dangerous. "Miss, you can come out now." The voice was barely above a whisper, so soft she almost missed it beneath the resumed conversations of the saloon patrons who were already returning to their drinks, as though attempted murder was merely an inconvenience. "It is safe." Eleanor lifted her head cautiously, her bonnet askew, and found herself looking at a pair of dusty leather boots. Her gaze traveled upward past worn denim, a gun belt slung low on narrow hips, a plain cotton shirt the color of sand, and finally to a face shadowed by the brim of a black hat. The man had lowered himself into a crouch beside the table, and even in the dim light filtering through the damaged window, she could see eyes the color of amber studying her with something that looked like concern. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice still pitched low, gentle as a lullaby. "But the floor beneath that table is likely to give you more splinters than a porcupine has quills. May I help you up?" He extended his hand, palm up, waiting. Eleanor noticed the calluses, the dirt beneath his nails, the thin white scar that ran from his thumb to his wrist. A working man's hand, but it remained steady and open, not grasping or demanding. She placed her smaller hand in his and allowed him to help her emerge from beneath the table, though her legs shook so badly she nearly stumbled. His other hand caught her elbow, steadying her with the same careful gentleness. "Thank you," Eleanor managed, brushing dust from her dark blue traveling dress with trembling fingers. She could feel eyes on her, the curious stares of saloon girls and gamblers, the bartender who had gone back to polishing glasses, the piano player who was flexing his fingers as though considering whether to resume his performance. She hated being noticed, hated being the center of attention. "You are new to Tombstones," the man said, still in that same quiet tone. It was not a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. "The town has a reputation for excitement, I'm afraid. 2 factions of cowboys decided to settle their dispute just now, but it was more noise than danger. Most men around here cannot shoot worth a damn when they're drinking." Up close, Eleanor could see he was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His face was angular, all sharp lines and lean planes, but there was something in his expression that made her feel less panicked than she had moments before. He released her elbow once she was steady and took a small step backward, giving her space. "I am looking for Mrs. Chen," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain level despite the way her hands still shook. "I was told she runs a dress shop on Allen Street, but I seem to have become turned around. You are in the wrong establishment for dress shopping, though some of these ladies might appreciate your services if you are a seamstress." The man's mouth quirked at one corner, not quite a smile. "The Oriental Saloon is not generally considered appropriate for respectable women, but you are welcome all the same. Mrs. Chen's shop is 3 buildings down, on the same side of the street. I can walk you there if you would like an escort." Eleanor wanted to refuse, wanted to assert her independence and capability, but the thought of walking those 3 buildings alone while her heart still raced made her throat tight. "I would appreciate that, thank you." He gestured toward the door, and they walked together into the brilliant Arizona sunshine. The heat hit Eleanor like a physical force, so different from the humid summers of Boston, dry and relentless. Dust devils swirled in the street where horses and wagons churned the earth into powder. She had never seen a place so brown, so devoid of the green she had taken for granted her entire life. "I am Nathaniel Hayes," the man said as they walked, his voice still pitched low enough that she had to lean slightly closer to hear him over the sounds of the busy street. "Most people call me Nate. I work the claim just outside of town, though I come into Tombstone for supplies and the occasional entertainment." "Eleanor Hartwell," she replied, stepping carefully to avoid a particularly deep rut in the road. "I arrived from Boston 3 days ago." "That is quite a journey. What brings a Boston lady all the way to the Arizona Territory?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger who had shown her unexpected kindness. "I saw an advertisement for a seamstress position. I have experience with fine needlework and tailoring. Mrs. Chen corresponded with me through letters and offered me the position." What she did not say was that she had been desperate to leave Boston, that staying in that city had become impossible after her father's debts had been called in following his death 6 months prior. She did not mention the creditors who had stripped their small home of everything valuable, or the way her father's former business associates had looked at her with calculation as though she were just another asset to be liquidated. She certainly did not speak of Marcus Thornton, her father's junior partner, who had offered to settle the debts in exchange for her hand in marriage and had not taken kindly to her refusal. They reached Mrs. Chen's shop, a neat wooden building with a painted sign that read "Chen's Fine Dressmaking and Alterations" in elegant script. Through the window, Eleanor could see bolts of fabric arranged on shelves, a dress form wearing a partially completed gown of emerald silk, and a small Asian woman bent over a work table with needle and thread. "This is your destination," Nate said, his voice still that same gentle whisper. "I hope you find your situation agreeable, Miss Hartwell. Tombstone can be a rough place, but there are good people here as well." "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Hayes." Eleanor met his eyes briefly, saw kindness there that made her chest ache with an emotion she could not name. "I am grateful for your help." He tipped his hat to her and turned to leave, but then paused and looked back. "If you need anything, or if anyone gives you trouble, you can find me at the assayer's office most days, or at the boarding house on Fremont Street. I would be happy to help." Then he was walking away, his long stride carrying him back down the dusty street, and Eleanor found herself watching him go before she caught herself and turned to enter the dress shop. A small bell chimed as she opened the door, and the woman at the work table looked up with a broad smile. "Miss Hartwell? I was beginning to worry you would not find me today. Welcome, welcome." Mrs. Chen set down her needle and came around the table, her hands outstretched. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm so pleased you have arrived safely. The journey must have been exhausting." "It was long, but I'm here now and ready to work," Eleanor said, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders in the presence of this welcoming woman. "I apologize for my appearance. There was some trouble at the saloon where I stopped to ask for directions." Mrs. Chen made a clicking sound with her tongue. "The Oriental, yes? Always something happening there." "The Earp brothers try to keep order, but there are too many men with too much silver in their pockets and too much whiskey in their bellies. Come, let me show you where you will be working and where you will live." The back of the shop opened into a comfortable workroom with 2 sewing machines, several dress forms, and shelves lined with supplies. Beyond that was a small living area with a kitchen, sitting room, and 2 bedrooms. Mrs. Chen explained that Eleanor would have her own room, and they would share the common spaces. The arrangement was more generous than Eleanor had dared hope, and she felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "I cannot thank you enough for this opportunity," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. You do not know what it means to me. Mrs. Chen patted her hand. I know what it is to be far from home and in need of a fresh start. I came to this territory 20 years ago with my husband following the mining camps. He died of fever in Prescott, but I had my skills with a needle, so I survived. Now I have more work than I can handle alone, and I need someone with your training and talent. This arrangement benefits us both. Over the following weeks, Eleanor settled into a routine that brought her more peace than she had known in years. She woke with the sun, helped Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast, and then worked until late in the evening creating gowns for the wives of mine owners, altering trousers for cowboys, and mending everything from petticoats to work shirts. The work was constant but satisfying, and Mrs. Chen proved to be not only an excellent teacher but also a kind companion. Eleanor saw Nate Hayes occasionally as she walked to the mercantile for supplies or visited the post office. He always tipped his hat and offered a quiet greeting, never stopping her or demanding her time, but his presence became a comforting constant in the chaos of Tombstone streets. She learned from Mrs. Chen that he was well respected in town, that he had a small but productive silver claim, and that he was known for his honest dealings and quiet demeanor. That Nathaniel Hayes is a good man, Mrs. Chen said one evening as they worked together on a complicated order for a woman who wanted a dress copied from a fashion plate in Godey's Ladies' Book. Not like some of these cowboys who spend their earnings on gambling and loose women. He saves his money, works hard, keeps to himself mostly. Some people think he is unfriendly because he does not talk much, but I think he simply prefers quiet. Eleanor did not respond, but she thought about the way Nate had whispered to her under that table, how his gentleness had cut through her panic like light through darkness. She had not told Mrs. Chen about her past, about the reasons she had fled Boston, but she suspected the older woman understood that Eleanor was running from something. The heat of July gave way to the slightly less intense heat of August, though the temperature still regularly climbed above 100 degrees. Eleanor learned to work during the cooler morning and evening hours, resting during the worst of the afternoon heat. She grew accustomed to the taste of dust in her mouth, the way sweat soaked her undergarments within minutes of stepping outside, the sudden violent thunderstorms that rolled in from the mountains and flooded the streets before disappearing as quickly as they came. She was walking back from delivering a completed gown to a client on the edge of town when she heard the shouting. Two men were arguing in the street, their voices raised in anger, and Eleanor felt her entire body go rigid. Her vision narrowed, and suddenly she was not standing on a dusty Arizona street but back in her father's study, listening to him rage at creditors, at business partners, at her mother before she died. She heard the crashes of furniture being thrown, the sharp crack of his hand against surfaces, the way his voice could fill every corner of a room until there was no escape from it. Eleanor's packages slipped from her hands, landing in the dust as she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The men's voices grew louder, and she flinched violently as one of them gestured wildly, his arm raised. She knew logically that he was not going to strike her, that she was not even involved in their dispute. But her body would not listen to logic. Her body only remembered the fear. "Miss Hartwell?" The voice was barely audible, a whisper against her ear, and she turned to find Nate Hayes standing beside her, his body positioned between her and the arguing men. "Look at me, Eleanor, just look at me." She focused on his face, on those amber eyes that held steady concern, and tried to slow her racing heart. He bent down and retrieved her packages without breaking eye contact, then gently touched her elbow. "Let me walk you back to the shop," he said, his voice still pitched low, soothing. "Those fools are arguing about a card game, and they will tire themselves out soon enough. There is no danger to you." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and let him guide her away from the scene. They walked in silence for a full minute before she finally managed to speak. "I apologize. I do not know what came over me. I am not usually so—" "Frightened?" Nate supplied gently. "You do not need to apologize for being afraid, especially not to me." They reached the dress shop, but instead of leaving immediately, Nate set her packages on the bench outside and turned to face her. Miss Hartwell, I have noticed that you startle when men raise their voices. I have noticed that you keep your distance from groups of men, and that you always position yourself near exits. I have noticed these things, and I want you to know that I see you, and that you are safe in this town. I will make certain of that. Eleanor stared at him, shocked by his directness and by the depth of observation his words revealed. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such simple honesty. Why would you do that? You barely know me. Because someone hurt you, and because I believe that the measure of a man is in how he treats those who are vulnerable. Nate's voice remained soft, but there was steel underneath it, a core of strength that Eleanor found both reassuring and attractive. I also happen to think you are remarkable, and I would very much like to know you better if you would permit it. Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks, and not from the Arizona sun. I am not asking for anything except perhaps your company occasionally, Nate said quickly. Maybe you would allow me to walk with you sometimes, or to bring you something cool to drink when the heat is bad. Small things, Eleanor, no pressure, no expectations. Just two people becoming friends. The way he said her name, like it was something precious, made her breath catch. She thought about how lonely she had been, how isolated she had made herself in an effort to feel safe. She thought about how Nate had never once raised his voice in her presence, how he moved carefully around her as though aware of the fragility of her nerves. She thought about how her heart beat faster when she saw him on the street, and how she had started to look forward to those chance encounters. I would like that, she said finally. I would like to be friends. Nate's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. Then friends we shall be. I will come by tomorrow evening if that is acceptable. Perhaps we could walk down to the courthouse. There is usually a breeze there in the evening. Tomorrow evening, Eleanor agreed, and watched him tip his hat and walk away, her heart doing strange acrobatics in her chest. Mrs. Chen was standing in the doorway when Eleanor turned around, her expression knowing. That man has been looking for an excuse to court you since the day you arrived, she said, not unkindly. He comes by here more often than necessary, always with some question about mending or with measurements for new work shirts he does not really need. I thought perhaps you had not noticed. I noticed, Eleanor admitted. I just was not ready to acknowledge it. And now? Now I think I might be ready to try. Nate arrived the following evening exactly when he said he would, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing. He offered Eleanor his arm, and they walked through the cooling streets as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible, too vivid to be real. Other couples strolled in the evening air, and Eleanor felt almost normal, almost like a regular woman out with a gentleman caller rather than a damaged thing trying to pretend at wholeness. Tell me about Boston, Nate said as they walked. What was it like growing up there? Eleanor chose her words carefully, editing her history into something more palatable. It is very different from here. Green and humid, full of old buildings and older money. My mother died when I was 12, and after that it was just my father and me. He was a merchant, always chasing the next opportunity. I learned needlework from my aunt, and I discovered I had a talent for it. Do you miss it? I miss the ocean, Eleanor said truthfully. I miss the sound of ships in the harbor and the smell of salt water, but I do not miss the city itself, or the life I had there. Nate nodded as though he understood the things she was not saying. I grew up in Texas, on a ranch outside of Fort Worth. My father raised cattle, and I was expected to follow in his footsteps, but I never took to ranching. Too much of the same thing every day. Too much dependence on weather and luck. I came to the Arizona Territory 4 years ago, looking for silver, and I found enough of it to make a decent living. Do you miss Texas? Sometimes. I miss my mother's cooking and the way thunderstorms would roll across the plains, but I like it here. I like the challenge of coaxing metal from stone, and I like the freedom of being my own man, answerable to no one. They reached the courthouse and stood in its shadow, feeling the slight breeze that made the evening almost pleasant. Other people moved around them, but Nate kept his voice low, creating an intimate bubble of quiet that made Eleanor feel as though they were the only two people in the world. Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you do not have to answer if you do not wish to, Nate said carefully. When you flinch at loud voices, when you position yourself near exits, is it because of your father? Eleanor's first instinct was to deny, to deflect, but something about the gentle concern in Nate's eyes made her want to tell the truth. Yes and no, she said slowly. My father had a terrible temper, especially after my mother died. He would shout and rage and throw things, though he never struck me, but he created an atmosphere of fear where I never knew what might set him off. After he died, his business partner began pursuing me, and when I refused his suit, he became aggressive. Not physically, but in other ways. He was determined to have me one way or another, and I knew that if I stayed in Boston, I would eventually have no choice. So I left. That took courage. It took desperation, Eleanor corrected. Courage would have been standing up to him, finding a way to fight back. Instead, I ran. Running from danger is not cowardice, Eleanor. It is survival, and it is smart. Nate turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I promise you that I will never raise my voice to you in anger. I will never use my size or strength to intimidate you, and I will never, ever force you into anything you do not want. Those are not just pretty words. They are vows I make to you right now. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks before she could stop them, and she wiped at them impatiently, embarrassed by the display of emotion. I am sorry, I do not usually cry. You never need to apologize for your feelings, not with me. Nate pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. I would consider it an honor if you would trust me with your tears as well as your smiles. They stood together as the sky darkened from pink to purple to deep blue, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, like a door she had kept locked was beginning to open just a crack. She was not naive enough to think that Nate could heal all her wounds or erase all her fears, but she was beginning to believe that perhaps, with time and patience, she might be able to build something new with him, something better than what she had known before. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Nate fell into a pattern of evening walks and quiet conversations. He told her about his work at the claim, about the frustration of digging through tons of rock for small veins of silver, about the satisfaction of finally striking a productive seam. She told him about the dresses she was creating, about Mrs. Chen's stories of the early mining camps, about the books she borrowed from the small lending library and read late into the night. Nate never pushed her for more than she was willing to give. He did not try to hold her hand until she reached for his first, and even then he held it gently, as though she were made of spun glass. He did not try to kiss her, though Eleanor sometimes caught him looking at her mouth with an expression that made heat pool low in her belly. He simply existed beside her, steady and patient, waiting for her to come to him in her own time. One evening in early September, a drunk cowboy stumbled out of a saloon as they were passing and began shouting at his companions who were still inside. His voice was loud and slurred, full of anger about some perceived slight, and Eleanor froze on the boardwalk, her entire body going rigid. Before she could even process what was happening, Nate had positioned himself between her and the drunk man, his body a shield, and was murmuring softly to her, "You are safe. I am right here. He is not going to touch you. Listen to my voice, Eleanor. Come back to me." The words were barely audible beneath the drunk's shouting, but they cut through her panic like a rope thrown to a drowning person. Eleanor focused on Nate's voice, on the solid presence of him, and slowly her breathing began to return to normal. The drunk man's friends emerged and dragged him away, still cursing, and gradually the street returned to its usual evening chaos. Nate turned Eleanor gently and guided her to a quieter side street, still speaking in that low, soothing tone. "There you are, that is better. Breathe with me, nice and slow. He demonstrated, and Eleanor matched her breathing to his until her heart stopped racing quite so frantically. Good. That is very good. Do you want to go back to the shop, or would you like to sit somewhere quiet for a moment? Sit, Eleanor managed. Please. There was a small park near the Episcopal church, little more than a few benches and some struggling cottonwood trees, but it was away from the main streets and relatively peaceful. They sat together on a bench, and Nate kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, telling her about a fox he had seen near his claim that morning, about the new vein of ore he had discovered, about anything and everything that had nothing to do with drunk cowboys or raised voices. Eventually, Eleanor found her voice again. Does it bother you that I'm so broken? You are not broken, Nate said firmly, though his voice remained soft. You are healing, which is different. Broken things cannot be fixed, but healing things just need time and care. And no, it does not bother me. If anything, it makes me admire you more. You survived something terrible, and instead of letting it destroy you completely, you found the strength to leave and build a new life. That is not weakness, Eleanor. That is incredible strength. I do not feel strong. I feel afraid all the time. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite the fear. You do that every single day. Nate reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm against her cheek, calloused but gentle. I am in awe of you. Eleanor turned her face into his palm, and the gesture felt like trust made physical. I care about you, Nate, more than I thought I would be able to care about anyone. I care about you too, Eleanor, more than I have words to express. His thumb stroked across her cheekbone, a whisper of touch. I would very much like to court you properly if you would allow it. I know we have been walking together and talking, but I want to make my intentions clear. I am falling in love with you, and I would like the opportunity to see if you might come to love me as well. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The old fear rose up, whispering that love was dangerous, that caring for someone gave them power to hurt her. But stronger than the fear was the longing, the desperate hope that perhaps she could have this, could have him, could have a future that was not defined by her past. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would like that very much. Nate's smile was radiant, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was the gentlest kiss imaginable, barely more than a brush of contact, but it sent electricity racing through Eleanor's entire body. He pulled back almost immediately, searching her face for any sign of distress. Was that all right? He asked, his voice rough. It was perfect, Eleanor said honestly. Could you do it again? The second kiss lasted longer, though Nate maintained the same careful gentleness. His hand cradled her face like she was something infinitely precious, and Eleanor felt tears leak from the corners of her eyes at the sweetness of it. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing harder, and Nate rested his forehead against hers. I will spend every day proving to you that you are safe with me, he murmured. I will be patient and careful and gentle for as long as you need. There is no rush, Eleanor. We have all the time in the world. As September turned to October, Eleanor and Nate's courtship deepened. He came to the dress shop every evening, helping her close up before they would walk together through the cooling streets. The brutal summer heat had finally broken, and the October nights were pleasant enough that they could stroll comfortably for hours. Nate told her about his dreams of expanding his claim, maybe bringing in a partner so he could work more of the promising veins he had discovered. Eleanor told him about her hope of one day opening her own shop, maybe in a larger city like San Francisco or Denver, where she could cater to wealthy clients who appreciated fine craftsmanship. Why not stay here in Tombstone? Nate asked one evening, as they sat on their favorite bench near the church. You and Mrs. Chen have a good business established. People know your work and seek you out specifically. Tombstone feels temporary, Eleanor said, trying to articulate feelings she had not fully examined herself. It is a mining town, and mining towns do not last forever. Eventually the silver will run out, and people will move on to the next opportunity. I suppose I want something more permanent, more stable. That is fair, Nate acknowledged, though I will point out that people have been predicting Tombstone's demise since the day it was founded, and yet it keeps growing. There are over 10,000 people here now, and more arriving every week, but I understand wanting roots, wanting to know that what you build will last. What about you? Do you plan to stay here? Nate was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I came here looking for silver and for freedom. I have found both, but lately I have been thinking about what comes next. The mining is good income, but it is hard work and uncertain. I have been saving most of what I earn, thinking that eventually I might want to invest in something more stable. Maybe a ranch, though not cattle like my father, or maybe a business in town. I have not decided yet. You could do anything you set your mind to, Eleanor said with conviction. You are one of the hardest working men I have ever known, and you are smart about money. Whatever you choose, you will be successful. That means a great deal coming from you. Nate took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I hope it will not frighten you off. I love you. I am deeply, completely, irrevocably in love with you. I love your strength and your talent and your kindness. I love the way you concentrate when you are working on a particularly difficult stitch, and the way you laugh at Mrs. Chen's stories. I love that you are healing and growing stronger every day. I love everything about you, and I needed you to know that. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I love you too, Nate. I did not think I would ever be able to say those words to anyone, but I love you so much it sometimes feels like my heart cannot contain it all. You do not know how happy that makes me. Nate brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I want to marry you, Eleanor. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like and wherever it takes us. But I also know that I need to be patient, that you need time to be certain, to know that this is truly what you want. How much time do you think you need to be certain? Eleanor asked, her heart racing. I have been certain since the first day I saw you covered in dust beneath that saloon table, looking at me with those wide, frightened eyes. But I'm asking about your certainty, not mine. Eleanor thought about the months since she had arrived in Tombstone, about how far she had come from the terrified woman who had fled Boston. She thought about how safe she felt with Nate, how he had never once given her reason to doubt his word or his character. She thought about the future she wanted and realized that all those dreams looked brighter and more achievable when she imagined sharing them with him. I am certain now, she said firmly. I want to marry you, Nathaniel Hayes. I want to build a life with you wherever that takes us. Nate's expression shifted from hope to joy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close while he whispered into her hair, You have made me the happiest man in the territory. I promise I will spend every day trying to make you as happy as you have made me. They told Mrs. Chen the next morning over breakfast, and the older woman's face split into a broad smile. Finally, I was beginning to wonder if you two would ever figure it out. Of course you have my blessing, Eleanor, though you do not need it. You are a grown woman capable of making her own decisions, but I am very happy for you both, and I think you are well matched. We would like to marry soon, Nate said, his hand finding Eleanor's under the table. Within the month, if possible. I know that is fast, but we are both certain, and I see no reason to wait. The only thing we need to decide is where we will live, Eleanor added. I do not want to leave you without help, Mrs. Chen, but I also need to think about my future with Nate. Mrs. Chen waved her hand dismissively. You worry too much, child. I managed before you arrived, and I will manage after you leave, though I hope you will continue working with me for as long as you are in Tombstone. As for living arrangements, have you considered building a house? Nate has the means, and a house of your own would give you both the fresh start you deserve. Nate and Eleanor looked at each other, and Eleanor could see the same excitement she felt reflected in his eyes. A house, she said slowly, testing the idea. Our own house, built exactly the way we want it. I have a piece of land about a mile outside of town near my claim, Nate said, his voice picking up speed as the idea took hold. Good flat ground with a spring, perfect for building. We could design something modest to start, but with room to expand as our family grows. The casual mention of a future family made Eleanor's breath catch, but in a good way, full of possibility rather than fear. I would like that. I would like that very much. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Episcopal Church, with Mrs. Chen and a handful of Nate's mining friends in attendance. Eleanor wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored silk, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs that had taken her weeks to complete. Nate wore a new suit that she had tailored for him, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. The minister kept the ceremony short and sweet, and when it came time for Nate to kiss his bride, he cradled Eleanor's face in his hands and kissed her with such tender reverence that half the witnesses were dabbing at their eyes. Afterward, they had a small celebration at the dress shop, with cake that Mrs. Chen had made, and champagne that one of Nate's friends had produced from somewhere. That night, Eleanor and Nate stayed in a room at the Grand Hotel, the nicest accommodation Tombstone had to offer. Eleanor was nervous, her mind spinning with memories of whispered conversations between married women, veiled warnings about a wife's duty and a husband's rights. But Nate seemed to sense her anxiety, and he moved slowly, carefully, talking to her in that same soft voice he always used. "We do not have to do anything tonight," he murmured, as they stood in the lamplight of their room. "We could just sleep, just be together." "There is no rush, Eleanor. We have the rest of our lives." "I want to be with you," Eleanor said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I am just nervous. I do not have much experience with this." "Neither do I," Nate admitted, which surprised her. "I have been with women before, but I have never made love to someone I actually love, someone who matters more to me than my own life. That is new territory for both of us." He helped her out of her dress with patient fingers, carefully working each button free, and Eleanor returned the favor, her hands shaking slightly as she removed his jacket and vest and shirt. When they were both down to their undergarments, Nate pulled her close and simply held her, letting her feel the warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart. "You are so beautiful," he whispered against her hair. "Not just physically, though you are that too, but beautiful in your soul, in your spirit, in the way you have fought to reclaim your life. I am in awe of you, Eleanor Hayes." Hearing her new name on his lips sent a thrill through Eleanor, and she pulled back enough to look up at him. "I am ready. Make love to me, Nate. Please." They came together slowly, carefully, with Nate checking constantly to make sure Eleanor was comfortable, that nothing he did frightened or hurt her. There was some discomfort at first, as she had been warned there would be, but Nate was so gentle and patient that the discomfort soon faded, replaced by sensations Eleanor had never imagined. She clung to him, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it, by the vulnerability of being so completely open to another person. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the hotel's clean sheets, and Eleanor felt more at peace than she had in her entire life. Nate traced lazy patterns on her back, his touch feather light, and murmured words of love and praise that made her eyes sting with happy tears. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for being patient with me, for seeing past my damage to the person underneath." "You were never damaged to me," Nate replied softly. "You were always perfect, always whole. You just needed someone to help you see that in yourself." They spent the next 2 days at the hotel, leaving only for meals, learning each other's bodies and preferences, talking about their plans for the future. Nate described the house he wanted to build for them, with large windows to let in light and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings. Eleanor talked about the garden she wanted to plant, even though she knew growing things in the desert would be a challenge, and about the sewing room she would set up so she could continue taking commissions. When they finally emerged from their newlywed cocoon, they threw themselves into the work of building their future. Nate hired a crew of carpenters and worked alongside them every day, helping to frame their house. Eleanor continued working with Mrs. Chen during the day and spent her evenings at the building site watching their home take shape from raw lumber and nails. The house was modest but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room, and a dedicated sewing room for Eleanor. Nate had large windows installed just as he had promised, and he built Eleanor a work table with his own hands, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters to catch on delicate fabric. By mid-December, the house was finished enough that they could move in, though there was still interior work to be done. Their first night in their own home, they lay in their new bed and listened to the wind whistle around the corners of the house. Eleanor felt Nate's arms tighten around her, and she snuggled closer, marveling at how completely her life had changed in just 6 months. "Are you happy?" Nate asked softly, his lips against her temple. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Eleanor replied honestly. "Sometimes I worry that it is too good, that something will happen to take it all away." "Nothing is going to take this away from us. We have built something strong and true, and we are going to protect it together." Nate's voice was firm, but still soft, still gentle. "Whatever challenges come, we will face them side by side. You are not alone anymore, Eleanor. You will never be alone again." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Nate would leave for his claim each morning after breakfast, and Eleanor would either work at the dress shop or take on projects she could complete at home. In the evenings, they would cook together, and Nate would tell her about his day while she told him about whatever project she was working on. Sometimes they would simply sit together on their porch, watching the sunset behind the Dragoon Mountains, content in each other's presence without needing to fill the silence with words. Winter in the Arizona Territory was nothing like winter in Boston. Instead of snow and ice, they had cool nights and pleasant days, with occasional rain that turned the desert briefly green. Eleanor discovered she enjoyed the mild winters far more than the brutal New England cold she had grown up with. In February, Eleanor realized she had missed her monthly courses, and a visit to the doctor confirmed what she had suspected. She was pregnant, due sometime in late September or early October. She was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, worried about what kind of mother she would be given her own difficult upbringing, but excited to create a family with Nate. She told him that evening as they sat down to dinner, simply blurting out the news before she could lose her nerve. "I am going to have a baby. The doctor confirmed it this afternoon." Nate's fork clattered to his plate, and he stared at her with wide eyes. "A baby! We are going to have a baby." Then a huge smile spread across his face, and he was out of his chair and pulling her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Eleanor, this is the most wonderful news. We are going to be parents." "You are not worried?" Eleanor asked, needing the reassurance. "Why would I be worried? You are going to be an amazing mother, and I am going to do my absolute best to be a good father. This baby is going to be so loved, Eleanor, so incredibly loved." Nate set her down gently, then dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Eleanor laughed and cried at the same time, her hands coming up to thread through Nate's hair. "I love you so much. Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family and a future I never thought I would have." "You gave it to yourself," Nate said, looking up at her with shining eyes. "You made the choice to leave Boston, to start over, to open your heart to the possibility of love. I am just grateful you chose to love me." As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, Nate became even more attentive and gentle than before. He insisted she not overwork herself, and he took on more of the household chores so she could rest. He talked to her growing belly constantly, telling their baby stories about his childhood in Texas and making elaborate plans for all the things he wanted to teach their child. In June, Mrs. Chen decided to retire and offered to sell the dress shop to Eleanor. It took some careful financial planning and a small loan from the bank, but Eleanor and Nate managed to come up with the funds. Eleanor hired 2 young women to help with the workload, training them in the techniques Mrs. Chen had taught her, and found that she enjoyed running her own business even more than she had enjoyed simply creating beautiful things. Mrs. Chen moved to San Francisco to live with her daughter, and Eleanor missed her dearly. But they wrote letters regularly. In her letters, Eleanor poured out her anxieties about impending motherhood, and Mrs. Chen wrote back with reassurance and practical advice. On September 28, 1882, Eleanor went into labor. Nate stayed by her side through the entire ordeal, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, even when the pain was so intense that Eleanor was certain she could not bear another moment. The doctor and midwife worked efficiently, and after 12 hours of labor, Eleanor finally heard the sound she had been waiting for, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Eleanor looked down at her son, at his red, scrunched face and tiny, waving fists, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this enormous new love. Nate was crying openly, his hand trembling as he reached out to stroke their son's downy head. "He is perfect," Nate whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor, you did so well. He is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's mother's father, the one member of her family who had shown her unconditional love during her childhood. Baby Thomas had his father's amber eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and from the first moment he was the center of their universe. Nate proved to be a devoted father. Taking to the role with enthusiasm and joy, he would spend hours holding Thomas, talking to him in that same gentle whisper he used with Eleanor, telling the baby elaborate stories about nothing in particular. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floors during fussy nights, and looked at his son with such complete adoration that Eleanor often found herself falling in love with him all over again. "You are going to spoil him," Eleanor said one evening, watching Nate rock Thomas long after the baby had fallen asleep. "That is a father's prerogative," Nate replied, not taking his eyes off his son's peaceful face. "Besides, I think it is impossible to give a baby too much love. Love is the foundation of everything good in life. I want Thomas to grow up knowing without a shadow of doubt that he is loved and valued and cherished." "He will know," Eleanor said softly. "With us as his parents, how could he not know?" As Thomas grew from an infant into a toddler, the little family found their rhythm. Eleanor continued running the dress shop with her employees handling most of the day-to-day work so she could spend more time with Thomas. Nate expanded his mining operation, bringing in 2 partners who helped work additional claims he had staked. The silver continued to flow, and they were more financially secure than Eleanor had ever imagined possible. Tombstone continued to boom around them, growing more civilized with each passing month. The Earp brothers and Doc Holliday had their famous gunfight with the Cowboys at the OK Corral shortly before Thomas was born, and the resulting tensions had made the town feel dangerous for a while. But gradually, order was established, and Tombstone began to feel more like a real town and less like a lawless mining camp. When Thomas was 2 years old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was not working quite as hard. Nate was even more protective this time, insisting that Eleanor hire additional help at the shop and rest frequently. Their daughter, Catherine Rose, was born in May of 1885, a small, fierce little thing with dark hair and her mother's eyes. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding, and Nate would patiently explain what they were doing and why, teaching his son to be gentle and careful with the new baby. "You are such a good big brother," Eleanor told Thomas one afternoon as he sat beside her while she nursed Catherine. "Your sister is very lucky to have you." "I protect her," Thomas said seriously, his small face solemn, "like Papa protects you." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, exactly like that. You are going to be a wonderful man someday, Thomas, just like your father." The years rolled by peacefully. Thomas started school and proved to be a quick learner with a particular aptitude for mathematics. Catherine grew into a spirited, talkative child who had opinions about everything and was not afraid to share them. Eleanor's dress shop thrived, gaining a reputation throughout the territory for quality work and fair prices. Nate's mining operations continued to be profitable, and he began investing in other businesses around Tombstone, including a share in the town's water company and a percentage of a freight hauling operation. They had their challenges, of course. There were illnesses that had Eleanor sitting up all night with sick children, financial setbacks when ore production slowed, tensions when exhaustion made tempers short. But through it all, Nate never once raised his voice to Eleanor. He would occasionally raise his voice to be heard over the children's playing or to call across a distance, but never in anger, never in a way that made Eleanor flinch or feel afraid. True to his wedding night promise, Nate had proven that he could be trusted with Eleanor's heart and her healing. There were still moments when something would trigger her old fears, when a door slamming or a man shouting in the street would send her back to that place of panic. But Nate had learned to recognize the signs, and he would immediately lower his voice to that familiar whisper, grounding her with his gentle presence until the fear passed. "I am sorry," Eleanor said after one such episode, when a summer thunderstorm had startled her badly enough that she had dropped the plate she was holding. "I thought I was past this by now." "Healing is not linear," Nate said, helping her clean up the broken pieces. His voice was soft and patient, completely devoid of frustration or judgment. "You have come so far, Eleanor, but that does not mean the old scars never ache. I do not mind being patient with you. I will be patient for the rest of our lives if that is what you need." In 1887, when Thomas was 5 and Catherine was 2, the silver production in Tombstone began to decline significantly. The mines were flooding as they went deeper, and pumping out the water was becoming prohibitively expensive. Many miners and businessmen began to talk about leaving, following the next boom to other parts of the West. Nate and Eleanor discussed their options extensively, weighing the pros and cons of staying versus leaving. Tombstone was the only home their children knew, and they had built a good life there, but the writing was on the wall. The town's glory days were coming to an end. "I have been talking to some investors about a business opportunity in Tucson," Nate said one evening after the children were in bed. "The railroad has made it a hub for the entire territory, and it is growing rapidly. There is a need for quality goods and services, and I think we could do well there. Your dress shop would have a much larger customer base, and I could expand into other business ventures beyond mining." "Leave Tombstone," Eleanor said slowly, testing the idea. "Start over again in a new place." "We would not be starting from nothing this time," Nate pointed out. "We have savings, we have business experience, we have each other and our children. It would be an adventure, but a calculated one." Eleanor thought about it for several days, and the more she considered the idea, the more excited she became. Tombstone had been good to them, but it had also been a place of healing and transition. Perhaps it was time to move forward into the next chapter of their lives. "Let us do it," she said finally. "Let us move to Tucson and see what we can build there." They sold the house and Eleanor's dress shop for good prices, packed up their belongings, and moved to Tucson in the spring of 1888. The city was indeed booming, full of opportunity and growth, and they threw themselves into establishing their new life with enthusiasm. Eleanor opened a dress shop on Congress Street, in a building Nate purchased and renovated specifically for her business. She hired several skilled seamstresses and began taking commissions from the wives of railroad executives, mining magnates, and cattle barons. Her reputation for quality work followed her from Tombstone, and soon she had more business than she could handle. Nate invested in several ventures, including a freight company, a hotel, and shares in a cattle ranch south of the city. He proved to have a good head for business and a talent for identifying profitable opportunities. Within a few years, they were quite wealthy by any standard, though they lived modestly and saved most of their earnings. Thomas and Catherine adjusted well to Tucson, making new friends at school and enjoying the slightly more cosmopolitan atmosphere of the larger city. Thomas showed an interest in engineering and mechanics, spending hours taking apart and reassembling anything with moving parts. Catherine developed a passion for music and convinced her parents to get her a piano, practicing diligently until she could play quite well. In 1890, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that she was now 34 years old and had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. This pregnancy was more difficult than the previous two, and the doctor ordered extensive bed rest for the final months. Nate hired help for the household and spent every evening sitting with Eleanor, reading to her, or just holding her hand while they talked about everything and nothing. Their second son, Samuel, was born in February of 1891 after a difficult labor that frightened them both. But the baby was healthy and strong, and Eleanor recovered well, though the doctor advised against any more pregnancies. Eleanor and Nate agreed that their family was complete, and they were grateful for the 3 children they had been blessed with. The 1890s were good years for the Hayes family. Eleanor's dress shop became one of the premier establishments in Tucson, known throughout the territory for exquisite work. Nate's various business interests thrived, and he became known as a shrewd but fair businessman, the kind of man whose word was as good as a legal contract. They built a large house on the outskirts of the city, with modern amenities like indoor plumbing and gas lighting, and Eleanor finally had the garden she had always dreamed of, though it required constant watering to keep anything alive in the desert climate. Thomas attended the University of Arizona when it opened in Tucson, studying engineering. Catherine continued her music studies and began teaching piano to younger children, displaying her mother's gift for patient instruction. Samuel was a cheerful, energetic child who seemed determined to explore every inch of Tucson, keeping his parents on their toes. Through all the changes and growth, Nate and Eleanor's love for each other only deepened. They still took evening walks together when their schedules allowed, still sat on their porch and watched the sunset paint the Catalina Mountains in shades of pink and gold. Nate still whispered to Eleanor, his voice a constant source of comfort and reassurance, a reminder that she was safe and loved and cherished. On their 20th wedding anniversary in October of 1902, Nate took Eleanor to San Francisco for a week, their first real vacation away from the children and the businesses. They stayed in a grand hotel, ate at fine restaurants, and walked along the waterfront where Eleanor could finally hear the ocean again after so many years in the desert. "Do you ever regret it?" Nate asked as they stood on the pier, watching ships come and go from the harbor, leaving Boston, coming west, marrying me. "Never," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Everything good in my life started the day I got on that train. You saved me, Nate, not just from my circumstances, but from myself. You showed me what love is supposed to look like, how a man is supposed to treat the woman he loves. You gave me a family and a future and a happiness I never dreamed was possible." "You saved me too," Nate said softly, pulling her into his arms. "I was just going through the motions before you arrived, working my claim and accumulating money without any real purpose behind it. You gave me something to work for, someone to build a life with. You gave me meaning, Eleanor." They stood together as the sun set over the Pacific, and Eleanor marveled at the journey that had brought her from a terrified woman hiding under a saloon table to a confident businesswoman and mother, loved beyond measure by a man who had never broken a single one of his promises to her. The children grew and began their own lives. Thomas graduated from the university and got a job with the Southern Pacific Railroad working on bridge design and construction. He married a sweet school teacher named Margaret, and they gave Eleanor and Nate their first grandchild in 1905, a boy they named Nathaniel after his grandfather. Catherine married a young lawyer named Robert Garrison in 1907, and they settled in Phoenix where Robert opened a practice. She continued teaching music and became quite well known for her skill at the piano, sometimes performing at social events around the city. Samuel decided to study medicine, and he left for medical school in San Francisco in 1909. It was difficult for Eleanor to see her baby leave home, but she was proud of his ambition and determination. As Eleanor moved into her 50s and then her 60s, she gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the dress shop, turning over more responsibility to the women she had trained. She still took on special projects and commissions, but mostly she enjoyed the slower pace of life, spending time with her grandchildren and working in her garden. Nate also began to reduce his business commitments, selling off some of his interests and simplifying his portfolio. He wanted more time to spend with Eleanor, to travel, and enjoy the wealth they had accumulated. They took trips to California and Colorado, to Chicago and New York, even once to Europe, where they spent 2 months exploring England, France, and Italy. But Tucson always drew them back. It was home in a way that Boston had never been for Eleanor, and she loved the desert landscape that had once seemed so alien and harsh. She loved the brilliant blue skies and the dramatic sunsets, the smell of creosote after rain, the ancient saguaro cacti that stood like sentinels across the landscape. In 1920, when Eleanor was 64 and Nate was 67, they celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them. Thomas and Margaret had 3 children now, Catherine and Robert had 2, and Samuel had recently married a fellow doctor and was talking about starting a family of his own. "How did we get so lucky?" Eleanor asked Nate that evening after everyone had gone home. They were sitting on their porch in the gathering dusk, holding hands like they always did. How did 2 people find each other in the chaos of Tombstone and build all of this? "It was not luck," Nate said, his voice still that same gentle whisper even after nearly 4 decades together. "It was choice. You chose to be brave and leave Boston. I chose to help a frightened woman under a saloon table. We chose to be open to love, to trust each other, to build something together. Every day of our marriage has been a choice, Eleanor, and I have never regretted a single one." "Neither have I," Eleanor said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Nathaniel Hayes. Thank you for whispering when you could have shouted, for being patient when you could have pushed, for loving me when I was not sure I could be loved." "You were always worthy of love," Nate replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You just needed someone to show you, and I intend to keep showing you for as long as we both shall live." They sat together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love story that would echo through generations of their family. And if Nate's voice was a bit rougher with age, a bit more threadbare, it was still gentle, still tender, still full of all the love and devotion he had promised her that first day in Tombstone when he had noticed she flinched and had chosen to whisper ever after. The years continued their steady march forward. Eleanor and Nate moved more slowly now, their bodies showing the wear of long, productive lives, but their love remained as strong as ever. They were fixtures in Tucson society, known for their generosity and their enduring devotion to each other. People would point them out on the street, the elderly couple who still held hands when they walked, who still looked at each other as though they were young lovers rather than people in their 70s. Samuel finished his medical training and opened a practice in Tucson, specializing in children's medicine. He and his wife Clara had 2 daughters, and Eleanor loved having some of her grandchildren close by, loved the chaos of Sunday dinners when everyone who could make it would gather at the big house on the edge of town. In 1925, Eleanor and Nate celebrated their 43rd wedding anniversary quietly at home. Eleanor had suffered a bout of pneumonia that winter and was still regaining her strength, and Nate himself was moving more slowly, his joints stiff with arthritis. But they were together, and that was what mattered. "Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you?" Nate asked as they sat together in their sitting room, a blanket over both their laps even though it was a mild April evening. "You told me it was safe to come out from under the table," Eleanor said, her memory of that day still crystal clear even though it had been 44 years ago. "And then you offered me your hand." "And you took it," Nate said softly. "You were so scared, Eleanor. You trembled like a leaf in a storm, but you still took my hand. That was the bravest thing I had ever seen." "I am glad I did," Eleanor said, squeezing his fingers gently. "Taking your hand that day changed everything. It changed my entire life." "Mine too," Nate whispered. "Mine too." That night, they went to bed early, wrapped in each other's arms the way they had been for over 4 decades. Eleanor fell asleep listening to the steady beat of Nate's heart, the same sound that had comforted her through pregnancies and illnesses, through worries about children and businesses, through all the triumphs and challenges of their life together. She woke in the early hours of the morning to find that Nate's breathing had changed, become shallow and irregular. She called for Samuel, who came quickly and examined his father with practiced hands and worried eyes. "His heart is failing," Samuel said gently, taking his mother's hand. "I do not think it will be long now. I am so sorry, Mama." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She climbed back into bed beside Nate and held him close, whispering to him the way he had always whispered to her. She told him she loved him, told him about all the ways he had made her life beautiful, told him it was all right to rest now, that she would be fine, that their children and grandchildren would take care of her. Nate opened his eyes one final time, focused on her face, and smiled. "My Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My brave, beautiful Eleanor, I love you. I will always love you." "I love you too," Eleanor said through her tears. "Thank you for everything, Nate. Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me so well." He squeezed her hand weakly, and then his eyes closed. His breathing slowed, became peaceful, and as the sun began to rise over the Catalina Mountains, Nathaniel Hayes took his last breath with his wife of 43 years holding him close. The funeral was held 3 days later, and it seemed like half of Tucson turned out to pay their respects. Nate had been respected and liked, known for his integrity and his gentle nature, and person after person came up to Eleanor to tell her stories about her husband's kindness, his quiet generosity, his willingness to help anyone who needed it. Eleanor accepted their condolences with grace, but inside she felt hollow, scraped raw by grief. For 43 years, Nate had been her constant companion, her partner in all things, the person who knew her better than she knew herself. The house felt too big without him, too quiet, and Eleanor found herself wandering from room to room, looking for him even though she knew he was gone. Her children rallied around her, taking turns staying at the house to make sure she was never alone for too long. They worried that she would fade away without Nate, that grief would take her too. But Eleanor was made of sterner stuff than they realized. She had survived her father's rages and Marcus Thornton's threats, had crossed half a continent alone, had built a business and raised children and created a life from nothing. She would survive this too, though it would be the hardest thing she had ever done. "Papa would not want you to give up," Samuel said one evening, finding his mother sitting in the dark on the porch, staring out at the desert. "He would want you to keep living, to find joy where you can." "I know," Eleanor said softly, "and I will eventually. But right now I need to grieve, Samuel. I need to miss him and remember him and let myself feel how much it hurts to lose him. Your father and I had something rare and precious, and I'm not going to minimize that by pretending I am fine when I am not." "That is fair," Samuel acknowledged. "Just promise me you will not give up. Promise me you will keep living, for him and for us." "I promise," Eleanor said, and she meant it. Slowly, painfully, Eleanor learned to navigate life without Nate. She forced herself to get out of bed each morning, to eat regular meals, to see friends and spend time with her grandchildren. She went back to the dress shop occasionally, taking on small projects that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. She worked in her garden, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing growing things in the harsh desert soil. The grandchildren helped more than anything. They were full of life and noise and questions, pulling Eleanor out of her grief with their demands for stories and cookies and help with homework. She told them about their grandfather, making sure they knew what kind of man he had been, how he had loved them all so much. One afternoon, Thomas's oldest grandson, young Nathaniel, who was now 20 years old, came to visit. He had just gotten engaged and wanted Eleanor's advice about marriage. "How did you and Grandpa make it work for so long?" he asked as they sat together in the garden. "Everyone says you two had the most loving marriage they had ever seen. What was your secret?" Eleanor thought about the question carefully before answering. I do not know if there was one secret exactly, but I think the foundation of everything was respect. Your grandfather respected me, truly respected me, from the very first day we met. He never tried to control me or diminish me. He never raised his voice in anger or used his size or strength to intimidate me. He was gentle and patient and kind every single day for 43 years. And you? How did you respect him? I trusted him, even when trust was the hardest thing in the world for me. I chose to believe in his love and his goodness, even when my past experiences told me to be afraid. And I worked to be worthy of the love he gave me, to be the partner he deserved. Eleanor smiled through her tears. We were not perfect, Nathaniel. We argued sometimes, we had disagreements and disappointments, but we never lost sight of the fact that we were on the same team, that we loved each other more than we loved being right or getting our way. That made all the difference. Young Nathaniel hugged his grandmother tightly. Thank you, Grandma. I hope I can have even half of what you and Grandpa had. You will if you choose wisely and love well, Eleanor assured him, and if you ever need advice, I am always here. Eleanor lived for another 7 years after Nate's death. Years that were bittersweet, but not without joy. She watched her grandchildren marry and have children of their own, making her a great-grandmother multiple times over. She saw Samuel's medical practice flourish, saw Catherine perform at concert halls across Arizona, saw Thomas become chief engineer for the Southern Pacific Southwestern Division. She kept the big house on the edge of Tucson, though it was far too large for one old woman. But it held too many memories for her to leave. Too many echoes of Nate's laughter and the children's voices and the life they had all built together. She would walk through the rooms sometimes, remembering dinners around the big table, Christmas mornings with presents piled high, quiet evenings sitting by the fire while Nate read aloud from the newspaper. On what would have been their 50th wedding anniversary, Eleanor went to the cemetery and sat beside Nate's grave. She told him about everything he had missed, about the great-grandchildren he would never meet, about how the world was changing with automobiles and radios and all sorts of modern marvels. She told him she still loved him, that she missed him every single day, but that she was grateful for every moment they had shared. Thank you, she whispered to the carved stone that bore his name. Thank you for noticing I flinched. Thank you for choosing to whisper. Thank you for loving me so well that I learned to love myself. You gave me the most precious gift anyone has ever given me, Nathaniel Hayes. You gave me a life worth living. Eleanor Hartwell Hayes died peacefully in her sleep in March of 1932 at the age of 76. Her children found her in the morning, lying in the bed she had shared with Nate for so many years, a peaceful smile on her face. On her nightstand was the handkerchief Nate had given her on their first walk together, now yellowed with age but carefully preserved, and a photograph from their wedding day showing two young people gazing at each other with expressions of complete and utter love. She was buried beside Nate in the Tucson cemetery, and her headstone read simply, Eleanor Hartwell Hayes, 1856 to 1932, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She was brave enough to take his hand, and together they built a love that lasted forever. At her funeral, Samuel stood up to speak about his mother and father, about the love story that had shaped his entire family's existence. My father once told me that the measure of a man is in how he treats those who are vulnerable, Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. He lived that belief every day of his life, but especially in how he loved my mother. He saw her fear and her trauma, and instead of dismissing it or becoming frustrated by it, he adapted. He whispered when he could have shouted. He waited when he could have pushed. He loved with patience and gentleness and unwavering devotion. My mother, in turn, was brave enough to heal, to trust, to love despite everything she had suffered. Together they showed all of us what real love looks like. Not the passionate, dramatic love of novels, but the steady, enduring love that weathers storms and celebrates triumphs and chooses every single day to be kind and patient and true. They left us a legacy of love that will continue through generations. Every time one of us chooses gentleness over harshness, patience over frustration, understanding over judgment, we honor their memory. They taught us that love is not just a feeling, but a choice, an action, a commitment to treating another person with dignity and respect no matter what. I miss them both terribly, but I'm so grateful that I got to witness their love story. It changed me, shaped me, made me a better man, husband, and father, and I know it did the same for all of us gathered here today. The Hayes family continued to grow and flourish in the decades that followed, spreading across Arizona and beyond. But they never forgot Nathaniel and Eleanor, the couple who had started it all with a whispered conversation under a saloon table in Tombstone. Their story became family legend, told and retold at reunions and gatherings, a reminder of what love could be when two people were willing to be vulnerable, patient, and true. Years later, one of Eleanor's great-great-granddaughters would write a book about her ancestors based on letters and diaries Eleanor had left behind. The book would become a bestseller, inspiring countless people with its story of trauma overcome through gentle, persistent love. Readers around the world would fall in love with Nathaniel and Eleanor, would root for them as they built their life together, would cry at their ending and smile at their legacy, because love like theirs does not die. It echoes through time, touching lives and changing hearts, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to be kind, to be gentle, to whisper when the world expects you to shout. Nathaniel Hayes had noticed that Eleanor flinched when men raised their voices, and he had whispered every word afterward. That single choice, made out of compassion and respect, had changed both their lives forever and had created ripples that would continue long after they were both gone. In the end, that is what love is: a choice to see another person's pain and respond with gentleness, a commitment to treat someone with the care and respect they deserve, a decision to be patient and kind even when it is difficult. Nathaniel and Eleanor had understood that, had lived it every day of their marriage, and in doing so they had created something beautiful and lasting and true. Their love story, which had begun in the wild, dusty chaos of Tombstone in 1881, would endure long past their mortal lives, a testament to the transformative power of choosing gentleness over harshness, patience over impatience, and love over fear. They had taken broken pieces and created something whole, had turned trauma into triumph, had proven that with the right person and the right kind of love, anything is possible. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, Nathaniel and Eleanor Hayes were together again, holding hands as they had always done, his voice still a gentle whisper, her heart finally completely at peace.